how do we try to embed those lived experience voices within our organisations and change the organisational culture to have lived experience within the organisations in an ongoing basis?
Who wants to go first to having a go at that question? Knowing that we're going to have a number of questions, so not everyone needs to answer every question. Avega?
I think often there is that experience within organisations, but people don't feel that it's safe to share aspects of their experience. And I think maybe the local government staff here might know some of those issues came up in terms of their work on the Gender Equality Act, just trying to understand, you know, their workforces and looking at not only gender distribution across different jobs and salary scales, but also, you know, how many people with disabilities work for that organisation. So I think it is a really important question about organisational culture, and also recognising that people shouldn't have to feel that they have to have the answer for something because they do have, for example, a lived experience of disability. So I don't know, I think there's a lot to do with managers and organisational culture, so I'm opting out of any further comment.
Thank you. I actually think that a way to do that is actually to be organizations that are role models, so it's about actually the representation within the organization. I think that an organization actually has to represent the Australian population. 50% of the Australian population is actually people that are born abroad or have parents that are born abroad. So I think for me it's about acting as role model, but it's also about answering that actually we don't see people with lived experience only as people with lived experience, because a lot of people with lived experience also have the certification, the diploma, and a lot of other skills. And it's also about how do we make sure within the organization that the people are actually safe and that we don't harm them. And it's about potentially providing some specific clinical supervision, or it's really about making sure that the organization is actually ready to make sure that people feel safe and seen.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
I think from some of the presentations today and the work that you know, you've been looking at in this space, you can see that there's a range of different commonalities for working for different communities, but each has its own particular experiences and its own particular needs in terms of work within an organisation. I guess looking back to my previous work with LGBTIQ communities, there's a lot of resources around, and particularly that's really important because those identities are often very submerged or invisible in terms of the lived experience of a workforce. And there shouldn't be, the focus that we would always say is that it's not the focus on someone coming out, it's actually the focus on changing the whole of organisation and the universal culture of an organisation so that people feel celebrated, welcomed and able to be themselves at work and to offer their lived experience. So I think one of the key things is that it's often, again, like I said in the talk, there's a lot of pressure on individuals to be the change makers, and it's really got to happen from the leadership level down as much as possible, while creating that space for people to offer their expertise within the organisation.
Interesting, yesterday I was at Aboriginal community controlled organisations on Bunurong country, and some of the staff from that organisation were talking about the challenge of working and living on country and the burnout and exhaustion that comes from being that person that always gets asked. It was really interesting and very real, talking about on-country burnout and the expectations of being that person that gets asked constantly. Over to you, Liv.
So that is a very good introduction to what
thank
we
you.
were talking about as well, because I guess for us with smaller communities and smaller workforces, we don't have often that many people within the organisation that have lived experience that we either know about or who are willing to be part of design of policies, programs and services. And so our question was around is there any advice or tips or strategies you have about how we ensure we include the voice of people with lived experience without burdening particular individuals, and also ensuring, you know, obviously one person's voice doesn't necessarily represent the whole community either, and so we run into this struggle where we end up having either the same people involved in the consultations or not at all, because we don't want to keep burdening those people with having to be involved in the design every time. But we're wondering if there was some tips to kind of work towards getting better at that.
I actually think that there are more people than what we think that have actually the capacity to be involved. I think that it's about maybe a switch for us about trying to understand power dynamic and what does it mean. And what I mean by that is like potentially you see someone as maybe not a community leader, but actually this person might have an important role within their community. So what I mean by that is like I feel that we work often a lot with the same person, but they are more than what we believe, that actually have the capacity to be community leader and to be involved in the different projects we implement. No, not sure if it makes sense. Yeah.
We've been doing a bit of work recently in terms of looking at sources of lived experience, and it's important for us in our work as the Family Violence Peak to distinguish between the experiences of lived experience and family violence, which is a particular experience that then overlaps with other sources of lived experience. And lived experience in the workforce is a really important one, but for me in primary prevention, the primary source of lived experience is going to come from research. So research is where, you know, on a large scale, people have gone out and talked to people with lived experience. And in some ways, I believe we have a responsibility to use that first and foremost, rather than asking people the same questions that we can actually get the information elsewhere. Then it focuses the consultation that you might be doing with advocates and with people within your workforces to the things that you know that are more specific to the particular project or the particular thing. So I think there's a need to really learn as much as you can from any other sources before you actually go and do that broader consultation. In terms of how to do it when you get to that point, I think it's something that's really got to be negotiated. It really depends where people are at, what's happening for them, what other pressures they're under, and sometimes I think having a really explicit conversation and saying, I know that this is putting pressure on you, can we talk about whether you're up for it, what you're up for, how long for, and I'm going to check in with you about how you're going with it as you go along.
Yes, agree. I think also, you know, learning from what's out there, whether that's, you know, national research or other studies, the publications of different organisations, but then also thinking about how you've planned to do a consultation or how you're planning to do a co-design process, and to think about, you know, are there some assumptions in that could be re-examined, and you could think about doing things in a different way that would make it possible for people to be available and interest to join in. So again, that importance of transparency, thinking about, you know, the time commitment, remuneration, other support that would be needed. So yes, all those important things that I'm sure you're thinking about already.
We'll go to this table. Heidi, you've got that. There you go.
So we're interested around the recent strategy in Safe and Equal and the organisational commitment to an intersectional approach in primary prevention practice. So interested in the response from staff around being engaged in that, what their reaction was, how you created a safe space to do that and what that looked like, and their general feedback.
Luckily, the two organisations that merged, Safe and Equal, had a very long history in grassroots activism and feminist history, feminist grassroots activism. And a lot of it, the drive for this came from our CEO, who has a very strong commitment to that, but also from the younger staff. And I think you'll find, I'm sure you can all relate in the organisations, that we often get pushed by the younger staff to do better and to make stronger commitments around these things. One of the interesting conversations that we had was the difference between how intersectionality, we think about and apply it across different fields of work. So for instance, there was a big discussion that we had between intersectionality in service delivery and service access and barriers and design, and then intersectionality in primary prevention. So we particularly focused on primary prevention because it's about social change, you know, and those commitments to a more rounded version of social change, but that still maintains a focus on one particular, not slice, that's not the right word, but you know, one particular lane in terms of that that social change that still allows all the other experiences of an overlapping drivers to be integrated within that, if that makes sense. So it's like I always have this vision in my head of like a lane, but overlapping bubbles of different things that need to be taken account of. I mean, it doesn't work for you as a metaphor, but anyway, you'll find it. Yeah. So actually, it was a interesting, provoking, and sometimes difficult, but very fruitful conversation that we had internally and then also with our partners in the process.
My question is how to balance the tension of meaningful relationship building and the time it takes within funding and program streams that are often outcomes focused.
Yeah.
And then, because as a collective, this was a common theme that came up, and we're wondering what is the opportunity for us as a sector to influence change in this structure.
Yeah.
Actually, we've been in that situation recently on one of our projects that is actually a co-design project, what we really call co-design. And the way to deal with it is actually, it's with the leadership. The leadership has to be very strong towards the funding bodies. And so it's a lot of negotiation actually with the funding body, because we started this project with some deliverable, but because we started working with communities and they actually told us, you know, differently, and it takes time because you need to build the trust and all of that. So it's actually, it's a lot of advocacy actually from the leadership. And I think that it's actually about potentially building the capacity of the department. For them to understand better what does intersectionality means, but what does actually is co-design. I feel that we talk a lot about co-design, but most of the time it's consultation, I feel. And so I think it's about developing resources, about what is co-design, what does it entails, and then, you know, the consequence that it has in terms of funding and flexibility that is required from the funding body.
So, Margins to the Mainstream had an evaluation that looked at the first 2.25 years of our project, which was the original funded period. And we had a great evaluator working alongside us doing the evaluation as the project was implemented. And when it came to the final report, she developed 4 recommendations for Women's Health Eastern partners, but she also added in 2 recommendations for funders, which was very strategic because I think, as all of us know in this sector, those short-term funding horizons are really difficult to do the long-term work that is needed. So one of them was about long-term funding and the importance of providing that beyond, you know, the 1 or 2 years or what have you. And the other was funding evaluation as an integral part of the project funding, which is also that part of building the evidence base.
Yeah.
And understanding, you know, what's working in practice and for whom. So I think it's very important.
Yeah, fantastic. And has been a consistent, ongoing challenge, hasn't it, in our sector for a long time. I think having some objectives and some indicators that relate to partnership development is another way of building in some outcomes that relate to that partnership work and that advocacy is important. You got a question asker here?
And our question was about how to combine all of the different intersections into our work, when a lot of the work that is done is based on categories like the pride in prevention, changing the picture. How do we sort of bring it all together to make sure that we're meeting the needs of everyone that we're servicing?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? Like, you know, people don't come as someone with a disability. They come as someone who might have a level of ableism, who might be in the LGBTQI community, who might have moved here as a refugee. Like, what is the approach? Anyone, do you go? I'll never give it back to the last to talk. Yeah, that's okay. The best.
Look, I think the first thing is you have to start with the individual experiences and understand those before you can actually start to put it together. I think that's a really critical one. The point that Aurora made in your talk, which we always used to make in Rainbow Health, was that thing of not trying to do everything at once, because you can't be everything to all people. It is okay to say we are focusing on one particular experience, so violence against women, or you know, you can look at gender in and of itself, but you've got to do that in a way that brings in all of the other overlapping experiences of oppression. So that's the thing of it. It's a way of thinking that you bring into all of your work, where it gets more complicated and where honestly we are still all working out what to do, is how it actually gets made practical. So any program that you're doing, you've got to bring that lens in and see how, check constantly that you're not continuing to exclude and you are, it is actually brought in. But I think in primary prevention, because so much of the work is done at that community level, that's where intersectionality, I think, really the focus needs to be. When we're working with communities, they've got their own ways of working with each other, and people shift and move, and they work within those communities. That's where we're trying to make the change. So that's where I think it becomes really important. I hope that helps.
And I think it's a question that's often asked, but I just took a very practical approach and said you have to start somewhere, and understanding the experiences of a particular group, and then thinking about what does that mean for your service or for your organisation is really important, because otherwise I think we go down that checklist. Intersectionality is about ticking all the boxes, and we have 10 spots for a consultation, and we invite a token, person X and another token person Y, and that doesn't achieve anything. So that was my trial answer. I don't know whether it's improved the second time.
You can be first on next one.
You talk about it's not up to the individuals to be the change makers. It needs to be the leadership down, and it was really about how do we approach the leadership? How do we get on board, and particularly in respect to rural areas?
And it's a tricky one, and actually I might need to get it to rephrase it for me. You ask, how do we actually engage the leadership in rural areas?
Or even just leadership, the challenges when they're not engaged.
Well, you know what, actually, I would say, and maybe I feel like it's the only word I've been using today, so sorry about that, but it's about capacity building. If we want our leadership to be actually involved, it's about making sure that they actually know about what we are talking. It's about also making sure that within the organization, we get the people, the people we work for that actually reach decision-making, position. So, And it's actually a very tough one. Marina, you?
Yeah. The only thing I've got to add is just, I think sometimes what we see people do, because we go into organisations and they have won over the board, and often it's like one staff member or a couple of staff members, and then they convince a team, and then they convince a division, and then they, we talk about getting the leadership on board, they're often the last. But that's when you've actually gotten somewhere.
No answers, but carrot and sticks.
Yeah.
And so I think, often the sticks come from the external environment and, expectations of, frameworks and requirements, etc. And yes, sometimes you just have to wait for the leadership to move on. I mean, it is often that change agent of a couple of key people who can do their best to navigate a complex organisational system can often do a lot.
No. Yep.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
I just add that actually I think that accountability is something that we don't talk often, but accountability of the organisation and accountability of the individual, and I think it's a way actually to have a leadership that's going to be engaged.
I think it's tricky, and it has an element of trickiness, that word, in rural communities, because people don't move on. That's actually a real issue. Like, people stay in jobs for a long time. There is not the job movement that happens in the metro area. And I think that it's tricky to put pressure on the champions in organisations to manage up. And it's really difficult for those champions to work in an authorising environment without senior leadership. So it's that, I think it's an enormous challenge, and I don't think you can ignore, because I think it's unfair to put pressure on the champions constantly. And so it's that different. Marina, you all talked about partnership was fundamental, collaborative memorandums of understandings, how you create that authorising environment, how do you take some pressure off the champions, how do you build the champions' ability to help them create their authorising environment. I think that the skills of health promoters, I reckon, the further you get out of Melbourne, it's actually a tricky space around influence.
Just from a really practical point of view, I think it's also using the leaders of organisations who are already on board to connect with the other leaders. Like, for instance, Emma is already on board, and so something like Respect 2040, how do you get the CEO of Women's Health and Wellbeing Barn Southwest to then meet with the CEO of your organisations, the directors to meet with directors, managers with managers, your health promotion staff to meet with other health promotion staff. And I think that's really effective. That's something I did in previous prevention of violence work, and it was really effective. I just went and, at the time, the CEO harassed all the other CEOs, our directors harassed all the other directors, and eventually it worked.
Yeah, fantastic.
How do we engage industry and as private organisations to commit to intersectionality? You know, how do we sell it to them? It might be just a key word.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's a lot of the similar challenges. And it really depends on the industry, the location, and I think often industry can be the last. The industry is very connected. They're not unconnected from their communities, and so even though they might have a particular focus, they're influenceable, particularly if they think it's going to impact on them as a business. But I think the key thing for me is focusing on how social change actually happens, and for me, it's actually about a broad-based social movement. So all of us will have experience being part of the sort of social movements around women's rights, gender equality, and those sorts of things. But I think actually the benefit of intersectionality, and sometimes we can focus on what becomes difficult when we bring intersectionality into the fore. I think what I find the benefit of it is to feel that moment of being in solidarity with other struggles. So, there's a big conversation going on at the moment about the voice and the referendum. We want to be allied with that struggle and overlapping and they're trying to do a lot of the same things that we're trying to do. Organisations that are focused on homophobia or transphobia, they're trying to do a lot of the same things that we're trying to do. So, I think social change also happens by ganging up on people. So the more that you can sort of work with different social change movements and kind of zero in on the people that you're trying to change, that's, in my mind, how you kind of get change to happen.
How do you deal with backlash?
You plan for it.
Yeah, you plan for it, yeah.
I think it's something that, I've worked in the LGBTIQ space where you have experienced some of the most vile and disgusting backlash of recent times. and you take it into account, you build it into your sense of workforce well-being, and you constantly look for positives and you look for solidarity.
Yeah. Fantastic. What a morning. What a great opportunity to talk and talk to each other, generate some questions, generate some really awesome discussion.